This is Craig Stocks, and this is the third of a series of 5 short videos talking about working with color in astro images. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the Photoshop details. In the next video, we'll actually start adding color to a monochrome image, and then in the 5th video, we'll work with blending colors. So we'll have different filters in different colors. So let's go back to this image that we looked at in the second video. And we go back to the layers palette rather than the channels. And we've been talking about the concept of different layers, and both adjustment layers as well as pixel bearing layers. And in this case, we're looking at a pixel bearing layer. If I add another pixel bearing layer, and I can use layer, new layer, or I can just use this plus icon at the bottom. And let's again add a gradient, and this time I'll just draw a black to white gradient going from the top to the bottom. By default, if we look here where it says normal, this is a list of blending modes. And what a blending mode does is determine how this layer is going to interact with the composite view of the layers below it. Because you're always looking at the buildup when you're looking from the top down. So in this case, this layer is in normal mode, which means it's completely opaque. We can't see anything through it. We also have an opacity value, and if I change this opacity from, let's say, 100% to a lesser value, now we're looking through it. It's only 10% opaque, and we're looking through it, and we can see part of what's below and part of what's above. Let's put it back to 100% opacity. And let's explore these blending modes because they have some very powerful opportunities for us in working with the images. As I mentioned, the default is normal. And if I expand this list, you'll see they're divided into different chunks. The first chunk is normal. The second chunk are all blending modes that generally darken the view. And the one you'll probably use the most if you use one of these would either be darken or multiply, which is a little bit more aggressive, using this layer to darken the view of the one below. The next group are lighten blending modes. So lighten basically just takes the lighter colors of what's on this layer and uses it to lighten what's below. Screen does that even more aggressively. Linear dodge is another one that gets used, and it basically just adds this layer to the layer below. The next group, overlay, soft light, and so forth, are interaction modes, where overlay and soft light add some of the light values and some of the dark values. So you can think about it pivoting at medium gray. If we have a completely pure medium gray overlay, soft light, these modes won't have any effect, but they will darken where it's darker and lighten where it's lighter. The last set we don't use a lot, other than I use subtract frequently to subtract stars from an image, and that's a whole nother series. And then the last one deals with blending just certain attributes of a layer, for instance, just the hue or just the saturation, or the color, which is both the hue and the saturation, and then lastly, just the luminance. So those are blending modes, and they affect how a pixel bearing layer or an adjustment layer affects our view of what's below. We also can have a mask, which we talked a little bit about in the earlier video. And pixel bearing layers by default don't come automatically with a mask. I can add a mask just by clicking on this little circle inside a rectangle, which kind of looks like a front-loading washer icon. And when I click on that, it will add a mask. By default, it will be white, which means we can see everything. And as we looked at before, if I just grab a brush and draw on the mask, I'm hiding this layer and revealing the layer below. So black on a mask hides the layer that it's on. Sometimes you want to be more precise than just painting, although you certainly can. So if we undo that by just filling this layer with white again, and important to note there's a double outline around the mask. If I click on the layer icon, you'll see a double outline around the layer. So when you start drawing on a mask, it's important to be sure that you're focused on the mask and not the layer itself. So if I want to select half of this, I can grab this rectangular Marquee tool and just drag out a selection. And what's called the marching ants shows what's currently selected. If I fill that with black, and I'm using a keyboard shortcut on Windows of alternate backspace, and that fills with the foreground color. And you can see on the mask now I filled the right side with black and hidden that from view. The white on the left side is still revealing everything, and we can still see the marching ants showing that the selection is still active. One powerful tool when you have a selection like this, whether you've drawn it, selected it with the Marquee tool or however you've got it, if you look at the properties panel, you'll see that there's two options for affecting the mask. One is we can affect the density of the mask. So maybe we only want to partially obscure what's below. So we can change the mask density from 0 to 100%, just like we could the layer opacity. We can also, I'm going to do Control D to get rid of the marching ants here, and that just deselected that active selection. I also have a feather slider, and I can feather this a little, or a lot, or a whole lot if I go way over here to the right. And what that does, again, we can see the preview on the thumbnail, it lets me soften that selection so that things blend together a little more gently. And you can, the advantage of doing this versus blurring is if I blur the mask, I can't unblur it. If I feather the mask with this slider, getting back to the principle of non-destructive edits, I can feather it or I can unfeather it, depending on the situation. If I decide I've gone too far, I can undo things. Selections are extremely powerful ways, and if you have a selection active when you create a mask, then that selection gets applied to the mask. So let me just drag this mask down to the trash. So, and notice when I did that, it applied it. So I'm just going to start this layer over. We'll add a new layer. I'll grab the tap G for the gradient tool, paint a black to white gradient. And so now we're back kind of where we started. This time let's grab the polygonal lasso tool, and it lets me just kind of click and draw a shape here. And when I get back to the starting point, you'll see a little circle appears on the cursor, and that shows me I'm going to close out that circle. You can also, if I just tap the backspace key, it will undo the last one. If I double click, it will close the shape and make the selection. So I now have an active selection. If I add a mask at this point, it automatically selected what was inside that selected area. And again, I can now feather this and get a nice big soft selected area. And this will work whether you're on an adjustment layer or a pixel bearing layer. You can adjust the feather, make selections, and so forth. A third way of selecting that is useful, this time I'm just going to choose to delete the layer mask. A third way of selecting that can be very useful is to go to Select, Color Range, and you'll get a window that gives you different options. You can select a sampled color. We can select specific primary colors. If you want to select stars, frequently you would select the highlights. And the preview is showing us in black and white what's selected and what would be not selected. I can adjust the range of what I consider highlights and shadows, and I can also change the fuzziness of how fast it rolls off. Is it an abrupt change, or does it give me some gradient or some cushion around the selection? And this can be handy to just select highlights and then tinker with the range and fuzziness sliders if you're selecting stars. So that's a little bit of an overview of the details in Photoshop. We've talked about layers and the way layers interact. We've talked about channels back in the earlier video. And this is a color image, so even though the red, green, and blue channels are all the same, it has the potential for having color. So in the next video, we'll start looking at actually adding color to a monochrome image.